Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to our second class on Zoroastrianism. This is the Unitarian Universalist Los Alamos Church comparative religion class for adult RE, adult religious education. And like I said, this is the second class. The first one, we covered Zoroastrian beliefs. This class is mostly about practices, what Zoroastrians do and how they implement their beliefs. So, the first thing I want to point out is that I've tried to make some tools recently, and maybe they'll work out, maybe they won't, but I tried to make some stuff for you guys to use that might make the class go better for everybody. And one of them is this web page I created with Google Sites because it's free and I can do that easy and it's simple. And so it's sites.google.com/view. Unfortunately, you have to have the view in there. It makes it harder to remember. And then comparative religion. But I put that link, I believe, in the email I sent out. And this is what that looks like. When you view the computer, it looks a little different on the tablet. But it's got a navigation bar over here. This is the home page. And this is the text of the email I sent. Telling people about the class. It has a link to the stream that we're having right now. If you click on that, you could presumably watch me live if it was working. And then it's got a flyer down here that we've been passing around. And at the very bottom, I've got a link to the last class we had before this one. And then if you go to course content, here you can get to my YouTube channel. And then here you get to the other class I teach at the UU Church, the biblical scholarship class. But if you go to the syllabus, you end up here. Here's the lecture I gave in 2016 on similarity. Here's the lecture I gave on differences in religions. Here's one on prehistory, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia. You'll notice some of these have bad recordings. I need to probably redo that class. I don't know how else to get a good recording of it. Some of these I've done, but I haven't put on yet, like the Hinduism, Buddhism, and then Zoroastrian. Here's the set of lectures on Mormonism. Here's the Unitarian Universalist history that Ann did. I haven't put the links to that yet, but when I create all these links, the idea is you could go there and you could pick your subject and look at all the past classes, and eventually I'll put all the handouts and all the links to and suggested readings and bibliographies for each topic there too. So hopefully that'll be useful. If for no other reason than you forget when the class is, the dates will be there, and hopefully I'll put the dates up, weeks in advance with any luck. And so there'll be links to if you lose it, link to the live stream. If you forget when the class is going to be, if you miss a class and need to go back and rewatch it, I'm hoping that will help you. So there's that. That's the thing I've been playing with and created recently. Yes, David. Yeah, that's part of what happened. I got sick for about a week and missed a week of work, and I sat and recorded or put up my old videos. So back when I did the lectures on Mormonism, for example, I wasn't recording the videos, but I had the slides and I had recorded the audio. So I went back and redid the slides, syncing up with the audio, and recreated a video for that class, and I posted those old classes on Mormonism and some of these other topics, including Buddhism and things. So that's kind of my first thing I've been trying to create for you. Let's review what we did last time. You notice I like Stephen Prothero's pattern for religion. I think it's a really good way to give an introduction and overview of what a religion is. Every religion in the world presumes that there's something wrong with the world. You look around and there's suffering, or there's sadness, or there's sin, or there's wickedness. And so something's wrong. It's lack of social justice, whatever it is. And so you posit a problem, you posit a solution, and then you have some mechanism to implement the solution. How? How do you solve the problem? And those things make up, are a good way to introduce a religious topic. And so this is what we came up with for Zoroastrianism last time. The problem is a war with Ahriman. So there's a war between good God, Ahura Mazda, and an evil God, Ahriman. And the solution is to choose and fight for the good God. Free agency is the deciding issue that every human has, and which will eventually decide who wins the war. We get to choose. And then if you decide to fight for Ahura Mazda, how do you do it? Well, it's by purity in thought, word, and deed. So purity of thought, word, and deed is the mechanism whereby we fight for Ahura Mazda and against Ahriman, and will guarantee that eventually he loses. And of course, they believe that he will lose, and that loss is guaranteed because humanity will naturally choose good over evil, because good has better outcomes, and eventually humankind will realize that. Zoroastrians, I think, have an interesting relationship to Unitarian Universalists in the sense that they're not Unitarian, they're dualistic. But the Universalist element, it seems like, and we'll talk about this in a bit, these people and this religious tradition is the origin of a lot of the things we didn't like about Protestant Christianity, this belief in a hell where you will burn forever, that sort of thing. You know, the John Edwards, sinners in the hand of an angry God sort of sermon, that really does make God out to be a real monster who likes to create people just so he can fry them forever. And we don't like that, and yet the origins of that idea of a hell where people burn seems to be Zoroastrian. The irony of all that is Zoroastrians are also one of the few and first Universalists, because while they believe in a hell where people burn, they don't believe that hell lasts forever, and in the end of days, all people would recognize that it's better to be good than wicked, and everyone will repent and worship Ahura Mazda, and God will eventually save everybody. So they are the origin of everything we didn't like that caused so many of us, our ancestors and things, to become Universalists, and at the same time, they are themselves one of the few religions of the world that was Universalist and preaches this idea of salvation of everybody. So that's an interesting kind of contradiction. Here are the two books I recommend for learning about Zoroastrianism. This one I recommend for everything. So almost every time I teach a class, I tell people to buy this book. It's The Ancient Near East by William Dunstan. Don't buy the one that costs $100 and something. If you find a link on Amazon, you'll find it for $100 and something. You'll also find it for $5. Because it went out of print for a little while and the price skyrocketed and someone hasn't realized it's back in print and they're still trying to sell it for $100. But you can find it for $5 to $10, $15, something like that. So this book is a history of the ancient Near East, and the very last chapter in this book is on Zoroastrianism. So if you want a 10-page introduction to Zoroastrianism, the last 10 pages of this book do that. But it also has the history of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Israel, Syria, the Hittites, the Philistines. And so as a book on the ancient Near East, this is kind of the place to go. So The Ancient Near East by William Dunstan. Zoroastrianism, however, is an impossible subject to find a good book about. It's just really hard. I looked for a long time and found very little good material. The only history I found of the nations that were Zoroastrian spent all its time on the Peloponnesian War from the Greeks' perspective, even though its title was The History of Persia. It had nothing to do with Persia. Anyway, this is the one thing I found. It's called The Zoroastrian Faith, Tradition, and Modern Research by a guy named S.A., and I have no idea how to say this, Negocian, something like that. And as I progress through this class, I'm going to slaughter a whole bunch of Persian words. That's just because I have never heard them said, I've only read them. So I apologize to anyone watching this who knows how these things are supposed to be pronounced when I destroy them. So I recommend those two textbooks, one to get a history of the ancient Near East and one for a more in-depth study of Zoroastrianism. I'm not terribly satisfied with this other book. It has kind of almost a scholastic perspective that isn't terribly approachable, but I haven't been able to find much else. If someone finds something, please send me a message or something, email. So I want to review again some of the stuff we did. This is the historical background. We've talked about Sumeria, Akkadian, Babylon, Near Assyria, Neo-Babylon in our earlier classes on Mesopotamia, but now we have the Achaemenid Empire Alexander the Great, the Seleucid Empire, the Parthian, the Sassanid, and then the Islamic conquest. And these ones in the bottom on orange provide the nations in which our story of Zoroastrianism plays out. Cyrus the Great was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. He's the one who conquered the Neo-Babylonians and then sent the Jews home. The Jews had been held in captivity. You remember he told them to go home and rebuild their temple and that sort of thing, and sent them back to Jerusalem and Israel. And he seems to be, and his group seem to be, the world's first Zoroastrians. So these are the Zoroastrian nations. We covered the life of Zoroaster. He was a prophet who said he was born of a virgin. So there's a virgin birth story. He has miraculous stories from when he was a child, healing birds and this sort of thing that also shows up in the infancy Gospels of Jesus, if you read any of those. And then he eventually, at the age of, I think, 20, had a vision. No, at the age of 20, he left to seek the truth. And at the age of 30, he claimed to have had a vision of Ahura Mazda, and then he spent the next 10 years trying to convert somebody and converted one person. So goes the story. About 10 years later, he converted a king who we haven't actually been able to find for sure who he is. We think we may have some ideas, but we don't know. And supposedly he converted a king who then kind of converted his entire nation to Zoroastrianism, and Zoroastrianism took off. So what does Zoroastrianism sell as a proposition for why you should be a Zoroastrian? Well, the Mesopotamians didn't have a problem with evil, with understanding evil, because to them the world was a capricious place, and the gods were sometimes petty. And the problem with worshiping gods who are distinctly petty is that we all have a human desire to worship something that's worthy of our worship, something we can look up to. And that means it has to be powerful, because then it's worthy of our worship and we'll be on the side that will win. But it also has to be moral and good, because we all want to be on the right side of things. And so worshiping an evil god just doesn't appeal to a lot of people. And Zoroastrianism sold this idea, possibly for the first time, of a truly great, good God. Well, we know that there were earlier versions of this, but this is one of the first kind of experiments in monotheism, minus the Egyptian version we talked about. The problem with having a truly good God is then you have to explain why the world is bad and has problems. And the Zoroastrian solution to that is what we call dualism. There's a truly good God, but there's also a truly evil God, and both of them are co-eternally existent, and they've been around forever, and there is now a conflict between the two, and we are involved in that conflict through our agency and choice. And of course, the way we act then is through purity of thought, word, and deed to solve that problem. Now, I want to make a quick comment. In the last class, spontaneously, because of a question based on this, I got off into a side topic of psychology and the role of thought in religion. It's a very interesting subject, and it's actually one that I would like to spend a little more time on. But I first at least need to clarify what I said last time, because I think I spouted the word psychoanalysis, and then I started talking about psychotherapy without distinguishing. There is a distinction. I know the distinction, and I just didn't. I mudded in my head and said things that were confusing. So to clarify what happened last time, psychotherapy is the Freudian idea that all of our thoughts and all of our dreams and things have some sort of a subconscious origin that we need to explore, that usually has something to do with having sex with your mother or wanting to kill your father or some such. And it's mostly been repudiated by modern psychologists. Now, psychology is not my field, but this is related, so we'll talk about how it's related in a second. Psychotherapy is a broad brush. There's a lot of forms of psychotherapy. One of them is talk therapy, cognitive basis. I've just spaced it. Anyway, and their approach is to recognize the truth that what's happening to us is not nearly as important for our well-being as how we react to what happens to us and the stories we tell about it. So the idea here is that you tell a story like, I always fail. I'm a failure because I always fail. And the psychologist will try to talk you through that and confront unhelpful thoughts with other thoughts. No, that's not true. I have succeeded. When have you succeeded? And so you learn the skill of kind of confronting these negative thoughts with other more positive thoughts. In contrast, mindfulness-based sort of stress reduction is a psychological approach based on Buddhism that has a slightly different approach, and it says, it's just a thought. Watch it with curiosity till it goes away, because your thoughts are stories that don't represent reality. Don't give them power even to respond to them. They're not real. Don't pay attention to them. And modern psychologists tend to use a mixture of the bottom two. There is no real purity in that. I don't mean to imply there's this war between these two approaches, because you can do a little of both. You can ignore some thoughts and just say they don't mean much, or you can confront other thoughts, both with. What's interesting to us from a religious perspective is how do religions deal with thoughts? And Zoroastrianism has a very distinct approach to this, but so does Christianity, Judaism, etc. So if you look at the sins in the Torah and in the other kind of writings of the law and the prophets, the Jewish Old Testament, their approach to thoughts is, for the most part, all the sins listed are active sins, things you do, with a few exceptions. One of them is covet. You don't commit adultery, and you don't covet your neighbor's stuff or your neighbor's wife, so don't even think about it. And don't do it and don't think about it. But those are two of the, then I think there's a couple others, but I believe those are nearly the only two, if not the only two, that reference thoughts. David, you can probably clarify here.
What that Hebrew word means. There's a modern belief that what that Hebrew word means is actually take.
Okay, so even that one has nothing to do with thoughts then, but if David's right. So in its modern translation, it's usually covet, to think about, but Hebrew was kind of a dead language that was resurrected, and so we have to go back and try to figure out what some of these words means, and there's often disagreement. But there's Judaism. For the most part, it's not focused on thoughts. Christianity, on the other hand, comes along, and Jesus says, it's said of old time, don't commit adultery, but I say to you, don't even think about it, is basically what he says. And this creates an approach where people feel a lot of guilt for their thoughts, not just their actions. Now, it's reasonable to want to control your thoughts. The danger here, and the last time I used the words obsess about thoughts, and I think I said it in a context where it sounded like I was talking about psychology. No psychologist would ever encourage you to obsess about your thoughts. By definition, obsession is bad. But certain religious traditions can cause you to obsess about your thoughts, and here's why. If I try not to think about committing adultery with my neighbor's wife that I think is beautiful, the problem is that our thoughts, the way they work in our brain, is associative, meaning anything we think about that is near the thing will cause the thought to arise, because thoughts arise by association. So the thought, I don't want to think about committing adultery, will cause you to think about committing adultery by definition. And to illustrate this point, you can sit and try not to think about a pink elephant for 5 minutes. Set a timer. When you go home, go do it. Actually do it, because it's illustrative. And actively try not to think about a pink elephant for 5 minutes. And the act of trying not to think about a pink elephant for 5 minutes will cause you to think about a pink elephant obsessively. You will obsess about pink elephants. The way to not think about a pink elephant is to, after the timer goes off, stop and think about a pink elephant for a while, realize that's boring, and then go do something else. I also don't want to generalize to all of Christianity. Christianity is a very broad brush, but a broad organization with lots of subgroups. But the Christian approach to thought is distinctly different from the Jewish one, and it labels thoughts themselves as a sin, and that you then have to control and repent of and feel guilty for. In contrast, well, not in contrast, Zoroastrianism does the same thing. In fact, Zoroastrianism explicitly says, and this is why it came up and why it's relevant, purity in thought, word, and deed is exactly the realm in which the war between Ahriman and Ahura Mazda is being played out. And so your thoughts, when they are inappropriate, are contributing to the other side's eventual victory. And so you have to control not just your actions, but your thoughts. In fact, it's entirely possible that's where Christianity gets that from. In contrast, again, Buddhism, which is where the other mindfulness-based stress reduction sort of thing approach comes from, Buddhism says, as psychologists now believe, thoughts are associative. They come from the environment around you and your background. They arise and they fall away, and they really don't mean very much. Watch them with curiosity until they go away. And what's more interesting than the thought isn't what thought you're having or why you're having it. It's, why does my brain act like this? And it replaces an attempt to judge yourself for your thoughts or control your thoughts with curiosity about where your thoughts are coming from. And again, magically, once you start thinking about where your thoughts are coming from, you're no longer thinking about adultery with your neighbor's wife, and it just goes away on its own. And that's the Buddhist approach to thought, is to not give credence to them, to not even confront them, because you don't want to give them the power that they would even come by being confronted, because they're not real. They're just thoughts. Ignore them. Watch them. Whatever you want to do with them, but they're just don't give them power over your life and credence. Now, I can't comment very much on the psychology. My field is religion, but to pay attention to how the different religions deal with thoughts is a very informative and fascinating sort of thing to do. And I believe it impacts our culture because we came from a Christian culture that gave a lot of power to thoughts. If you want to see how this plays out, there's a self-help book called As a Man Thinketh. And it is the best illustration I've ever seen of someone who thinks thoughts are everything. Thoughts are the beginning, the wellspring from which actions flow, so you need to control your thoughts. And don't worry about your actions, worry about your thoughts, because if you just get your thoughts right, your actions will follow. And I think that's problematic for the reasons we just described. It doesn't work very well. It just creates a lot of guilt. Okay, so there's our role of thoughts in religion and how Zoroastrian plays into it, because it is explicitly focused on thoughts as one of the three realms in which the battle takes place. And it probably influenced Christian thought about this too. Okay, so what are we going to do now? That's kind of what we did last time, a review. We talked about Zoroastrian practices, rituals, purity, and then we talked about the theory of purity last time. This time we're going to talk about the rituals and actions that lead to purity. We'll talk about fire temples, washings, initiations, sacred clothing, etc. We'll talk about the Zoroastrian sources, and by that I don't mean, books about Zoroastrian. I mean the Zoroastrian scriptures, what we use to learn about Zoroastrian kind of as scholars. And we'll talk about the problem of timing, when did ideas enter Zoroastrianism, when did they enter Judaism, when did they enter Christianity, and who borrowed from who? That's the problem of influence and timing. And timing will drive the problem of influence, because it's hard to figure out the timing. Okay, so let's start with ritual and practice. The Zoroastrian concept of purity is the heart of the war. Again, is purity of thought, mind, and deed. So it's all about purity, because that's how we choose between good and evil. And so how they define purity will then motivate the rituals they perform and the practices they have. So in Zoroastrian thought, certain things convey ritual impurity. These things are blood, sweat, spit, breath, hair, fingernails, feces, corpses, certain unclean animals, etc. Now, if you're familiar with Leviticus, this should look really familiar to you. It's not identical. In fact, in Hebrew, the breath is sacred because it's the wind from God that breathes. And as long as you're alive, there's a breath living inside of you, and the breath is associated with the Spirit. In Zoroastrian thought, it's interesting because they took something that one side sees as the symbol of purity and turned it into something that the other side sees as a symbol of impurity. But there's a consistency to the Zoroastrian thought. Spit is impure, and when you breathe, you sometimes spit on people, and you talk, and you get excited, and you spit. And anything that leaves the body that's supposed to be in the body is impure once it leaves. Thus feces and spit and blood and semen and menstrual fluid, all that stuff is impure once it leaves the body. We've talked in the past about how there's a psychological underpinning for these purity laws and an evolutionary background to them. People who are disgusted by things we as humans are disgusted by survive longer than people who don't, because we get sick less. Things that are going to make us sick, and we avoid certain things that are dangerous, and it keeps us healthy. So there's a biological underpinning for this idea that certain things give us a yuck factor. The problem is our brains and evolution did not know about germs. It just knew that certain people died more often than other people. And so germs can stick around even after it looks cleaned up. And so we developed a propensity for a feeling that dirty things maintain dirtiness and pure things maintain purity. So if I were to pass around a hoodie and tell you that this is the Unabomber's hoodie, most of you wouldn't want to touch it. And there's no germs we know now associated with it. But you'll notice how our brain associates both ethical impurity and physical impurity and dirtiness together. They get linked up in our brain, and we can't tell the difference. And we know they linger. We feel like they linger on physical objects after the fact. So this psychological thing drives these sorts of purity rules in Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and Islam, and Christianity, and they're all over the world. So these are the sorts of things that these people felt were impure. They are also associating with certain animals, which they associate with the war. Ahriman created certain animals. Ahura Mazda created other animals. The animals that one created are clean. The one that the other god created are evil, which is not necessarily the case in Judaism. There's no, as far as I know, association with the unclean animals with some sort of evil demon. But in this case, there is. And so, of course, you don't eat these things. And you also be able to tell a Zoroastrian priest, especially one who's trying to maintain a high state of purity for certain ritual performances, because they will wear a veil. And the veil, the purpose of the veil is to prevent their breath and spit from leaving their mouth and making other things around them impure so that they can keep things pure. Now, how does the purity rules impact the war between Ahriman and Ahura Mazda? Well, I think one way to maybe think about it as a Westerner who's not steeped in this sort of thing is it's not necessarily sin. It's not like if I bleed, I'm sinning. It's not an ethical violation, but it is unclean, of the dirty sort. And heaven is clean. So you don't want to track your mud in heaven. And so although it's not ethical, and they will distinguish between ethical forms of impurity and ritual forms of impurity, they feel like one is just like tracking dirt around. And heaven has to stay clean. So if you want to go to heaven, you have to cleanse yourself first. And if you want to perform rituals that are efficacious to God, you have to clean yourself first, because you can't be tracking mud around into that ritual and expect it to be efficacious and work. So this is about cleaning yourself so that you're ritually clean in order to make your rituals efficacious, and then ethically clean as well. So it's ethical and ritual cleanliness both matter to God. And just as an immoral act helps Ahriman win the war, so tracking mud around in the world makes the world a worse place, and thus helps him win the war. So cleaning things up helps the good God win, just as being ethical helps the good God win. So these are the sorts of things that convey purity. Nirangudin, again, I'm going to slaughter these terms. It's consecrated bull urine, which you would think would convey impurity because it is a form of bodily excretion. Ash, dust, and pomegranates and rice and some of these other coconuts, these sorts of things convey purity. So I've tried to figure out where the bull urine thing comes from, because that's the easiest one to kind of get. Our ick factor is crossed with their cleanliness factor, just as with the Hebrew breath, there was a sacred versus profane cross. I think what's happening here is these people are steeped in a more ancient world in which they made their own soap. And the way you make soap is you mix ash and urine, and it creates some chemical reactions that produce lye, and you can make homemade soap that way. And that makes you clean. So this was actually literally a cleansing agent, I believe. And that's probably where that comes from, although I don't know for sure. David, do you have thoughts? Go ahead and use the mic, though, so that other people can hear you.
I'd always understood that soap was an invention of the Gauls that didn't spread more broadly until the Romans conquered them. So, you know, this stuff there probably wasn't soap at the time of the origin of Zoroastrianism.
That's possible. Like I said, I could be
you
wrong.
can't clean yourself with ash, for example.
Yes.
As a kind of scrubbing thing.
They are cleaning themselves with ash and with urine, and if you mix those together, you're creating a lye soap, whether you mean to or not. So I don't know. I know they're cleaning themselves with ash and urine, and the first thought I had is, oh, that looks a lot like soap. But again, this is a theory. I don't know for sure where this is coming from. So I didn't actually know where soap as a product came from. That's interesting. I have rituals for making yourself clean. They've got a really big one. Barashum is a 10-day ritual, 9 nights, 10 days, where you purify yourself. Priests will go through this. Sometimes lay people will try to do it once in their life. You also do it if you touch a corpse or carrion or some other really big form of impurity. But that's the big deal. Not everyone does that. Nahum is the simpler thing. People do that on special occasions. This is a ritual bath. Think if you're a Jewish, a mikveh, if you're Christian, a baptism. They did it before the youth go through their equivalent of a bat mitzvah, which we'll talk about in a minute. And they do it before marriage. It's a marriage ritual, part of marriage ritual. And a lot of these other rituals that form major components of the Zoroastrian life, these things will be done, this ritual bath will happen first. Very much like the Jewish mikveh. Then there's also the padiab, which is something that people do multiple times a day. So you go through something you kind of do on, if you're a priest at the top, and then you have the ritual bath that you do on special occasions, and then there's something else you do kind of multiple times a day. And this ritual involved washing your hands, retying a cord, which we'll talk about the details of the cord in a minute, and saying a certain prayer. And you do that when you wake up, when you lay down and go to bed, etc. And every time you go to the bathroom, I believe, and before you eat. Is the paydob. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about sacred space in which Zoroastrians perform some of these rituals, and then we'll talk about the rituals they have for moments in people's lives. So, during the reign of Artaxerxes I and Darius II, Herodotus wrote. Now, Herodotus isn't always right, but part of the problem is, and we'll talk about sources in a minute, we don't have a lot of primary sources, so we're reliant on other people to tell us what the Persians were doing and what they believed. And here's Herodotus telling us what the Persians did, and the question is whether he's right. Okay, so during the reign of Artaxerxes and Darius II, Herodotus wrote, "The Persians have no images of their gods, no temples nor altars, and consider the use of them a sign of folly." This is not accurate already, because we know they had images of Ahura Mazda. We've seen pictures of Ahura Mazda all over the place, but they probably didn't have idols of Ahura Mazda in their temple. They believed that Ahura Mazda was beyond human description, and they didn't worship with idols, which is probably what he's getting this from. And he says they have no temples nor altars, and consider the use sign of them a folly. Again, this is probably wrong. But what is he talking about? Well, they didn't offer Zoroastrians, we think, didn't offer sacrifice in the same way that the Jews did or the Greeks did. And they probably would have thought that was strange. But they did have altars, and they did have temples. We'll talk about it in a second. He says this comes, I think, from their not believing the gods to have the same nature with men as the Greeks imagine. Now, what's interesting about that statement is this is very early. This is early. We're trying to time when certain concepts entered Zoroastrianism. This is during the reign of Darius and Artaxerxes, and that puts it in the middle of the Achaemenid Empire. And he's already saying that they believe in a god who doesn't have physical forms like the Greeks and these other people. So that sets some of this stuff very early. This is much later, but this is a Sassanid coin, and it shows an altar, which is the opposite of what Herodotus just said. And so one of the questions is, was Herodotus right and the altar came later, or is he just wrong? We think he's just wrong because we think the early Iranian religion that Zoroastrian evolved out of had fire temples and altars. And so what he's probably talking about is that they did different things on those altars. Instead of offering sacrifices, what the Zoroastrians did is they had a perpetual fire that they just kept burning. Think of the Greek Olympic flame, or the menorah in the Israelite temple. But this is a perpetual fire that's just never supposed to go out, and you just keep it burning. And part of the sacred ritual is to keep this fire burning. And here we have a picture of two Zoroastrian priests surrounding a fire altar where the fire burns, fire temple. This is a modern fire temple. And again, how much this modern temple relates to the ancient fire temples is open for discussion and debate, which is why we're interested in things like what Herodotus says in these early Sassanid coins and this sort of thing. It says, the plaque at the entrance reads, the Zoroastrian temple, built in 1934, in a site belonging to the Association of the Parsi Zoroastrians of India, under the supervision of Jasnid Amanna, something like that. And this is in Iran for sure, even though it said it's built by the Zoroastrians of India. It's in Iran, which is one of those reasons I would love to be able to go to Iran someday. There's all sorts of fun things to see. And up here you have, this is their fire that has been burning. I believe they claim this one has been burning for 1,500 years or something. Now you notice the temple isn't that old, but they brought the fire from an earlier starter, and this is one of those sacred fires that has been burning for thousands of years. This is the outside of the temple. You'll notice the archetypical Zoroastrian symbol. Supposedly this has 3 layers of feathers, which are supposed to represent the purity of thought, word, and deed. So this is the temple, and in these temples they will do things like these purification rituals. They will feed the fire, etc. And again, fire is considered a sacred element. So let's talk about the rituals of a person's life. How do they mark moments in a person's life? Every religion in the world does this. Yeah, even we do this. You have something to celebrate the birth of a child, something to mark the death of somebody, something to mark marriages, etc. So the first ritual that we care about is childbirth. And in childbirth, the woman is considered unclean. You can imagine, if you believe that things exiting the body that are supposed to stay in, bodily fluids and blood, make somebody unclean. Childbirth is filled with those things. And we actually have one of there's a really great story about the discovery of communicable diseases among us, and to do with doctors who were going from one childbirth to the other without washing and spreading diseases, and the women were dying, and women who were staying home were surviving better than the women who went to the hospital because the doctors were spreading diseases through the blood because they weren't washing afterwards. So again, you can imagine that there's a biological reason to associate childbirth with some impurity. There's also feminist reasons to be really offended by what they then do with that, which is a woman after she gives birth, either when she's menstruating, she has to seclude herself. Again, there's a similar Jewish custom. And after giving birth, she's unclean for up to 40 days, depending on the group, and she separates herself for 40 days afterwards. Ritually speaking, though, they also will light a candle in the room where the mother and the child are secluded, sometimes for 3 days, sometimes for 40 days. And this lit lamp, actually I think it's a lamp of purified butter of some sort. And this lamp is supposed to put the sacred element in the room and protect the spirit, the new child from the evil spirits, etc. And again, if you remember the beliefs section, the belief in evil spirits is very real among Zoroastrians. In fact, they're probably part of the origin of the Christian belief in devils and archangels, both. Because you have servants of Ahriman and servants of Ahura Mazda. They're all engaged in this war. And so you kind of want to put the sacred element in there to keep the evil side of that war at bay, so the child can have a good start in life. The next one that's interesting is that 1 year they take him to the fire temples. This is where the fire temple actually plays a role. And he's marked with ash on the forehead. So I couldn't help myself. This sounds an awful lot like Ash Wednesday, although its purpose is entirely different. But it also sounds a lot like Titilaka of India, which is these markings they will place on the forehead. We'll talk more about that actually in a future lecture, because I'm going to do a class on Hinduism next month, so we'll come back to that. But again, this marking on the forehead is related also to, in Christian theology, the book of Revelations talks about marking people on the tops of their forehead, etc. So you're marking him with the sacred ash from the temple that burned the sacred fire, and this is part of his 1 year celebration. This is similar to circumcision in Judaism in the sense that it is the ritual that the young child goes through at a very early age that kind of marks him as a member of the community. But then when he's older, if you're in Jewish traditions, he becomes a son of the law, a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah, daughter of the law, son of the law, where at this point he is responsible to keep the commandments. His actions he'll be held responsible for his actions because he's old enough to be responsible. This age varies in Zoroastrian communities from 7, 11, 12, 15, depending on where you are. But this ritual is very much like a bar mitzvah. Now in Christianity, we don't have something quite the same usually because most Christian denominations baptize infants. The few Christian sects that don't baptize infants, this ceremony is akin to baptism. So it most closely resembles the Jewish bar mitzvah if you're on the Jewish side, and baptism if you're on the Christian side, but only if you are baptizing later in life, because this is a ritual that happens later in life. This ritual happens at 1 year old, at the earlier stage, where it more closely resembles the Jewish circumcision. So what was this one about? Well, first you have that ritual bath we talked about, the Nahum. Then the child faces east. There are prayers and confession. They give the child some sacred clothing, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then they sprinkle him with rice, grains, raisins, almonds, coconut, etc. And then they have a feast and banquet to celebrate the child's new status as an actual Zoroastrian. This is the sacred clothing. It's a white shirt with a string that you can tie. We'll talk about this in more detail. This is a diagram kind of the shirt. There's a pouch in the chest, and the pouch is designed to symbolize storing up good works over your heart, over your chest. You just kind of store up. Now there's a similar thing in Judaism called the breastplate of the high priest that had a pouch in it, wherein he would keep the Urim and Thummim so that he could carry the children of Israel in his heart as he officiated. It's not exactly the same, but there's this pouch over the heart idea in sacred clothing in multiple places. Both of them have to do with carrying things in the heart. This is about carrying your own good works to symbolize that you should have good works. The Jewish version is to carry the children of Israel in your heart to represent them as you officiate at the altar. It also has this string with 72 strands, 24 threads at the bottom. And this string is what you tie. Remember that second ritual that I said you do multiple times a day? It was the third, I guess, on my list of rituals. You wash your hands and you untie and then retie this string that is part of your sacred clothing. And you do it when you wake up in the morning, go to bed, after using the restroom, before you eat. And I believe there was maybe some other, but I can't remember the other times exactly that's done. So let's see. Oh, here, I got the text here. The shirt is a white undershirt, symbolic of purity. but has a small pouch at the chest, symbol of storing good deeds. The cord consists of 6 interwoven strands, each of which is made of 12 white woolen threads, making a total of 72 threads. Now, the 72 threads symbolize the 72 chapters of the Yasna, which is a scripture we will talk about in a minute. The 6 strands are braided together at each end of the cord to form 3 tassels, each of which contains 24 threads. The cord is worn like a belt or girdle over the shirt and is to be untied and retied daily on the following occasions: immediately after rising in the morning, at times of bathing, I missed that one, after each call of nature, before reciting prayers, I missed that one too, and before eating meals. This cord reminds me an awful lot of, this cord is a Brahmin priest, shown by the white cord over his shoulder, making the simplest, most elegant male and female yoni in the sand on the shores of a place I cannot pronounce. So the cord is a symbol given to him at his second birth ceremony, and it's made, and it represents his role as a Brahmin priest. So here we have a cord given at a birth ceremony earlier for the Brahmin priest in India that represents the fact that he is a Brahmin and thus a priest. It also reminds me a lot of the Mormon temple garment, which we talked about long ago, if you remember. And this picture is actually from the LDS webpage, where they talk about the meaning of their temple garments. So I'm not taking pictures I shouldn't, etc. But it also reminds me of the Jewish prayer shawl and also this Jewish undershirt that is worn. Now, the law of Moses says you shall leave the fringes of your garment. How does it go? You leave the fringes of your garment and just have fringes on your garment. Isn't that how it reads? And on the corners of your garment, that's right. Right, which not everyone wears something rectangular anymore, so now they have, in order to do that, because we no longer wear robes, they have an undershirt that you can wear under that has the 4 fringes. They also have 4 fringes on the corners of a prayer shawl. And the number of threads here represents, in Jewish tradition, the number of laws in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the law of God. So God has commanded 600 and, help me, David? 613 laws, and so there's 613 threads in this fringe. And again, in the Zoroastrian version, there are strands, and the number of strands represents the number of books in their scripture. So it's a very, very similar idea. In fact, it's so similar, I cannot imagine that there is not a direct connection. This isn't the sort of thing that arises. There are some things that arise spontaneously because we have similar human psychology. This is too exact for that. There must be, I believe, a more direct connection here. So, so this is again one, and if you've been following along, I don't have a nice list from last class and this class, but if you're following along the similarities between Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the list is getting really, really long. In fact, I had a list and it filled a couple pages and I gave up. So this religion is either influential in the formation of Judaism and Christianity as we know them today, or else it borrowed heavily from Judaism and Christianity as we know them today. And which of those is a question we're going to try to tackle here at the end. But very, very interesting stuff. The similarities are important to me. Especially interesting is the Armenian baptism ritual that has a cord and has a liturgy where you face east and face west and you renounce Satan, and then you face east and you turn to God. That moment of turning around, in Hebrew, repentance is to turn around. But that ritual in the Armenian church is almost identical to the ritual we've just been describing for the Zoroastrian. So it's clear, and Armenia is in the right location. So this is clearly a direct, this example at least is a clear direct borrowing. So let's talk about wedding now. Weddings are fun. I actually want to read this one because I don't want to just tell you about it. I just want to read what our friend Negocian says about this. So he says, the Zoroastrian institution of marriage offers yet another occasion for celebration of an important religious ceremony. On the day of the wedding, before the ceremony, the bride and bridegroom take a sacred bath. We've talked about that purification ritual already. The ceremony itself is generally performed in the evening, just a little after sunset, in order to illustrate that just as the day and the night and the light and the darkness are united at twilight, so do the bride and groom unite to share prosperity and adversity, happiness and grief. And then there's a procession where the women's family go to the bride's family go to the groom's house and leave a gift. And then they go home, and then the groom's family and the groom head to the bride's house. Once they get there, everyone enters the bride's house except the bridegroom, who stands at the threshold and submits to several welcoming ceremonies. His forehead is marked in red. Again, you notice the marking of the forehead that we saw earlier, then with ash, this time with red. This reminds me of the Hindu mark on the forehead. The foreheads are marked in red, rice is sprinkled over his head, an egg, a coconut, and a small dish of water are in turn passed around his head and then dashed to the ground. The bridegroom then enters, takes his seat, and after a decent interval, is joined by the bride. The couple sit opposite each other, separated by a piece of cloth. Hung between them is a curtain. A candle burns on each side of the couple, and nearby a fire burns in a container. This reminds me of the sort of veil concepts that we have, especially in later Christianity. The officiating priest now performs the ceremony of union, which includes symbolic rituals, the exchange of vows, prayers, admonitions, and benedictions. All the assembled guests are then entertained in a marriage feast. Yes, David.
Are these descriptions of rituals, do you know what Zoroastrian communities they're based on? I mean, there are the Parsis in India. I know there are still Zoroastrians in Iran. I don't know if there are any insignificant numbers elsewhere. Do you have any idea what communities these?
I found a bunch of pictures for the ones I used, for example, for their equivalent of the bar mitzvah, from a community in New York. Believe it or not. The book here talks about the Indian community of Zoroastrians and the Parsis and the Iranian community. The Iranians are more rare. They were mostly persecuted by Muslims to the point where most of them left and ended up in India. But there are still some there, and he will mention these rituals, and then usually in the text, at least as an aside, he'll say, and the ones in India do it this way, and the ones in Iran do it this way. So he mentioned what they all do, and then he'll mention the deviations. So there are some. For example, when we talked about the initiation ritual, where you become a Zoroastrian, they give you your sacred clothing and you tie the rope. He mentions that the age when that ritual is done differs between the Iranian and the Indian communities. So I don't know if that answers your question. There are differences, but they're not. And I didn't focus on those as I put this together. But the other one that's interesting is the Soma. So if you've heard of Soma, remember that was Brave New World. That was the drug everyone took. Soma is a drug that Hindus was part of in Iranian and Indian rituals before Zoroastrianism. It was intoxicating, according to the texts we have. No one knows exactly what it was, but it was a sacred plant, and you would eat it, ingest it, and have visions of heaven and have this great feeling of connection to everyone else in the universe, etc. Zoroastrians still have a Soma ritual, but they don't. The plant they currently use today for this ritual is not intoxicating. So it couldn't be the one that the ancients used. We don't know when it changed, how it changed, or what the ancient version of the plant was. There's all sorts of fun web speculations about mushrooms and all sorts of fun stuff, LSD, etc. But the descriptions usually involve this feeling of love and connection, and it's almost like ecstasy. Is almost when I read descriptions of people who've taken ecstasy, and this is very similar. But what's interesting to us, even though we don't know what the plant is that the Zoroastrians still do it. And this ritual where they share this food is incredibly similar to the Christian communion. So again, we have another similarity where you share this meal, and it's actually even considered the body of God, and there's all sorts of interesting connections there. And there's more: death, prayer, priesthood, a daily ritual, memorials, festivals on certain days, and there's no way we can do all that. The only one I want to mention in a little bit more detail is death. You can imagine if you belong to a community that thinks that the body, when bodily fluids leave it, it's unclean, and the body itself on death, if touching a corpse is one of the sources of uncleanliness. And they worship, if you remember, the different elements, the earth, and the water. They have sub-deities of Ahura Mazda, who is each of these elements. You can imagine that creates a problem for what you do with corpses. Because if you burn the corpse, instead of using the fire to cleanse the corpse, which is one way that thought experiment could have gone, instead, you can think of it as the unclean body polluting the pure fire. So you don't want to burn the corpse. You don't want to bury it either, because if you bury it, you've polluted the earth, part of what you worship. So you don't want to take uncleanliness and put it in the ground. In fact, there's all sorts of theological, and some of the first kind of religious debates we have between the Christians and the Zoroastrians is when the Christians live in a Zoroastrian land and they want to bury their dead. And the Zoroastrians become furious because we have this theory that if you just all believe what you want, we can all get along. The problem is, if what I believe is that what you're doing is polluting my ground that I live and walk on, it doesn't work so well. And so there were all sorts of fights between the Christians and Zoroastrians with regard to what you do with the dead. And what the Zoroastrians did with the dead is they have all sorts of protections so that you don't impart impurity to yourself. They have certain people who are in charge of taking the corpse, and then they have to go through certain rituals of purity afterwards. And you take the corpse up to a mountaintop. I'm sorry, before that, you actually have a dog come and look at the corpse body. This is an interesting bit, the little dog. They have all sorts of, today, ritual interpretations of the dog, which I can't recount. I don't actually know what all of them are, but they have theological meanings for what the dog means, and the dog is supposed to look at the corpse first and gaze upon it. It turns out in ancient times, we actually think that the real origin of this ritual was the dog's role was to determine if the person was really dead, so you didn't, because sometimes you can't quite tell, is this person really dead? And so instead of having a medical examination, the dog would come and examine the corpse. And now it has all sorts of ritual implications that are above and beyond where it really originated from. But the dog looks at the corpse, and you carry the corpse up onto a pillar and a mountaintop, and you leave it. And the animals eat it. Which this is a case of cross sensibilities. Our sensibility is we don't want animals to desecrate the body. Their sense is the body is already unclean. We don't want it to desecrate the earth or the fire. Clean animals take care of the unclean. So the evil animals are the ones that are going to eat carrion already. They're the child of Ahriman. And so you put the body up on the mountain. It's eaten by these animals, and then you take the bones, you let them bleach dry so that they have no more of this secretions on them. You take them and you throw them into a well, along with phosphorus and some other things to try to dilute the impurity that they might convey into the earth. And this was one of the points of religious contention in early Zoroastrian communities, was death. But there's all these others, and we just don't have time to talk about them. Priesthood is interesting because the origin of priesthood is I guess it's well established in Judaism. It's a little bit harder in Christianity. We think it may have just borrowed its idea from Judaism itself, but in Zoroastrian, priesthood is hereditary. So you have to be a child of a priest to be a priest, which again is similar to the Jewish model, but very different from the Christian model. And there are certain days of the year and all that sort of thing, which we aren't going to do. All right, so in the next 15 minutes, let's try to cover this problem of who is influencing who and what are the real origins of these religious ideas that we've grown up with all our lives as people in Christian communities that seem so similar to these Zoroastrian beliefs we've just covered. So where do they come from? First, let's talk about the sources. First, we have to know where we're getting our information about Zoroastrianism. Not modern Zoroastrian, we can go ask a Zoroastrian, but ancient Zoroastrianism. So the first thing we have is some old Persian inscriptions. I'll show you one or two of them. These are the sorts of things from the reign of the Achaemenids. These Cyrus, Darius actually wrote inscriptions that mention Ahura Mazda. So we know that they worshipped Ahura Mazda. They mention it. They talk about fire temples, this sort of thing. We have, of course, Herodotus and some of these other Greek writers. And then we have these Christian critics who, in 200 CE, etc., they were in fierce competition with the Zoroastrians. And so they wrote critiques of each other. There are Zoroastrian critiques of Islam and Christianity and Christian critiques of Zoroastrianism. And so we can read the Christian critiques to figure out what the Zoroastrians were doing around 200 CE, which may be different than what they're doing now, but it at least dates certain things. We know by 200 CE they were already doing this because the Christians talk about it. We know that by the Old Persian period they were already doing this because we have an Old Persian inscription about it. And so this is where, and then you look at Herodotus. This is where you play if you're a scholar trying to pin down the origin and the direction of influence, or these texts. We also have the Zoroastrian scripture. The problem with the Zoroastrian scripture is it was probably originated around 700 BCE, 600 BCE, is where some of it came about. And then Alexander came and destroyed the Persian Empire and burned their records. And a lot of stuff became oral traditions, especially the things that were used in the liturgy. So if it was part of the liturgy, it got remembered in a way that other stuff didn't. So these early liturgies were remembered. And then around, I think 500 or 50 BC, they tried to collect them, etc. And then, of course, the Muslim conquest happened around 600 AD. And the same thing happened. Most of the Zoroastrian scriptures were burned and destroyed. And so around 1000 CE, you think the Christians are bad because we have a couple hundred years between Christ and earliest copies of the Gospels. 1000 AD, they tried to compile them and systematize them into a text that we now have as the Zoroastrian scriptures, known as the Avesta. And it has many parts. The Yasna, which is those, the number of strands, is the number of books in the Avesta. That's where that comes from. And part of the Avesta is called the Gathas. Most scholars believe the Gathas are the oldest part of the Zoroastrian scriptures because even the type of Persian that they're in is very old and ancient. So it has textual hints that say this stuff is old. Now that's not foolproof because often people will write things that are supposed to sound old and they use old language on purpose. But we believe that stuff is really old. And then there's some of this other stuff that's a little bit later. And I need to switch the order of these here. And I'm not going to try to read these. There's the Vispara, etc. You can read those. But these are some of these other pieces of the Avesta that's a little later. There's also these other texts that are relevant. So one way to think of this is like the law and the prophets. If you're Jewish, I think maybe if you were a Christian, this is the Gospels and the letters or something. But these texts have less authority than these texts. So there's almost a hierarchy of authority. This is the oldest. These are the most sacred. This stuff is sacred too. And this stuff is a little bit less. Maybe a better example is this is the Talmud or something. And this is the Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures. And then there's a bunch of these texts. So one of them is really interesting. This is the doubt dispelling explanations, which I have to read a piece from because it'll give you an idea of how Zoroastrians thought of their religion in comparison to Islam in this case, but Christianity, Islam, and the religions around them. So let's read this. It says, "Henceforth, I write of the inconsistency of their twaddle." You can say they have a good opinion of the Muslims. And of just observations. So he just called their writings twaddle, and then he's talking about making just observations. "You should estimate with wise regard. First, as to the full consideration of that one original evolution, which they, i.e. the Muslims, state thus, quote, the sacred being is one, doing good works, wise and merciful, so that good works and crime, true and falsehood, life and death, good and evil are all owing to him." And then he has citations, Quran 64:13, 64:18, 30, and 39. Then he says, "Now do ye ask of them thus, is the sacred being always compassionate and showing mercy, doing good works and justice and judicious, and does he know all that is, was, and will be?" So is he both good and all-knowing is the question. But the Quran just said he was. Because if he be compassionate, doing good works and showing mercy, then why are Ahriman and the demons and all these evil faiths of hell admitted by him into his own creatures through his own compassion, doing of good works and showing of mercy? If not known by him, in other words, if he's not all-knowing, then where is that knowledge and omniscience of him? So he either doesn't know about these evil things happening, but then he's not all-knowing, or he knows about them and lets them happen, in which case he's not all-powerful, or he lets them happen, in which case he's evil. Ergo, the Muslim God makes no sense, and you should be a Zoroastrian. Okay. But you can see that's a very early statement of what we call today the problem of pain, which is an argument that the vast majority of people, if you just survey people who claim they no longer believe in God, they grew up believing in God, they no longer do, and you survey the reasons, the problem of pain is usually listed as number one. Actually, number two after the hypocrisy of the believers. But so this is not a new thing, but it is an argument that is fairly old. It's been going on for some time, and you can see it fairly clearly expressed by the Zoroastrians in comparison to the Islamic faith, and they say the same thing of the Christians, by the way. Okay, so those are the Zoroastrian scriptures, and you notice one of the big problems we have has to do with how to date this stuff. Because you'd like to know when the Zoroastrians started doing something, because if they started believing in it before the Christians, then they're the originators. If they did it after, then the Christians are, and vice versa. So here's one of our early Old Persian inscriptions. And this is, again, we know that the Old Persians were worshippers of Ahura Mazda, of Zoroastrianism, believers of Zoroastrianism, worshippers of Ahura Mazda. And you get these sorts of inscriptions from very early times, Darius. Unfortunately, these subscriptions do very little except to have Darius mention the fact that Ahura Mazda approved of his right to be God, or to be king. So he justifies his kingship by appeal to Ahura Mazda, but they don't tell us very much. It's very unfortunate. These texts really don't tell us what the Zoroastrians of the time believed and how they worshipped and what they did, which is a huge problem and limitation with this entire question. So if we go back to this, we've got this, Old Persian inscriptions, but they don't tell us very much. We got Herodotus. He tells us lots of things, but he's wrong about half the time, as I just showed you in the earlier example. And then we have the Christian critics who are, of course, critical. Worse, they're late. Because if we're trying to find the origins of Christian practices, the Christians are already doing them. Where does the Zoroastrian stuff come from? The linguistic and historical affinity between the Gathas and the Rig Vedas, the Rig Veda is the collection of sacred texts of the India, and the oldest known documents in Sanskrit, is so marked that the assumption of a common cultural and linguistic origin is generally accepted by scholars. So, what we can say before we begin is that Hinduism influenced Zoroastrianism and was kind of the parent religion in many ways. Partly, there's also an Indo-Iranian religious tradition, but it is also, I don't think parent is the right analogy, it's co-evolved right next to the Hindu tradition. Now, this just gets into what I'm going to do next month briefly. I did Zoroastrianism right after Mesopotamia because the Persians are the heirs of the Babylonian Empire. Seemed to make sense. But it occurs to me that I really should have done Hinduism first. If you go to my webpage and look at the class, there is a lecture on Hinduism that is there and will be posted quickly. I don't think the video is up yet. What I did is I did a lecture called Far Eastern Temples, and it had temples. It focused mostly on temple traditions, and it did Hinduism, Buddhism, and Chinese and Japanese temple building traditions all in a lump thing in one kind of class. I've never really done a class just on Hinduism. So given Hinduism's relationship to Zoroastrianism, I'm going to do Hinduism next month. So if you come next month, that's the teaser for next month, we're going to do a class on Hinduism. If you're watching these online, I probably put them in the opposite order and put Hinduism before Zoroastrianism. But the first thing we can say for certain about influence is that Hinduism influenced Zoroastrianism. So we can say that. That's what we've got here. What's harder then is to say how that spreads out from Zoroastrian to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, or the other direction from those back into Zoroastrianism. What were you going to say, David?
How about the similarities coming from common Eastern Indo-European ancestors?
So,
in other words, not passing from India to Persia, but I mean, these people had common ancestors.
Right. So modern Hinduism obviously evolved from its earlier roots. And I'm not prepared to do a lecture on Hinduism right now, so maybe we can come back to this next month. But yes, I think there are earlier Indo-European or not in Iranian and Indian traditions that influence both. The Hindus would claim that they are that tradition that's still around. It has evolved from its earlier form. So when I say it was influenced by Hinduism, I mean it's influenced by early Hinduism, which of course influenced modern Hinduism, and they're not necessarily the same thing. They evolved. But that's maybe I'm not. I need to be more careful how I say that. So here's where it gets difficult. Now again, where are the moments of interconnection where concepts could have spread in either direction? The Achaemenid Empire, right here, is the first moment of connection, because that's when Cyrus brings Zoroastrianism into Babylon, conquers Babylon, and finds the Jews already there in Babylon captive and sends them home to build the temple. So that's our first moment of connection. There's a moment when either the Jews can be influenced by the Zoroastrians, and the Zoroastrians can be influenced by the Jews. The trick is to figure out what were the Jews already doing by this point, which is difficult because the biblical texts were written just before that, presumably in the Babylonian exile. But right in this moment is also when the Bible is, and the texts are being compiled and written, according to most biblical scholars. And so we have the biblical text being compiled at the same time that there could be this interaction. And what we really want to know is, what did the Jews believe before? That's a very difficult subject. We also want to know what the Zoroastrians believed then, and we just said we don't have that information. Herodotus isn't right, and the Old Persian texts are sparse and don't tell us. So we have two kind of unanswerable questions here, but this is that first moment of contact. Then we have Alexander the Great, and then down in here, in the Sassanid Empire, we have our next moment of contact, because the Sassanids are, and the Parthians are, in contest with the Christians. And at this point, Christianity has become a Roman religion and is a religion of empire, and these two religions are butting heads. And there's another moment of potential connection. Now, there is a principle that we could follow, and that is, usually we assume that the greater empire influenced the lesser. The US people now wear blue jeans and listen to rock and roll. The culture that is in a state of ascendancy tends to be the one doing the influencing, not the other way around. And so in this contact, it is possible, there were a lot of Jews there, it's possible to propose Jewish influence on Zoroastrianism, but it's much more likely, as just kind of a prior, that the information went the other direction. During this contact, could go either direction because we have two roughly equal nations butting heads. So here we have a point where the contact could go either way. Here we have a point where we would presume it would go from the Zoroastrians to the Jews. But that could be wrong. It's just a guess. You have to go on a case-by-case basis. So when we look at our scriptures again, we have the same dating problem. I want to give an example. Let's start with Satan. Now, this is an example I think we care about. Where does Satan come from? The modern Christian conception of Satan, engaged in an arm wrestle with Jesus over the fate of the world, sounds an awful lot like the Zoroastrian war between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, doesn't it? Where does this come from? Well, here's the interesting bit. If we try texts, which is hard, but if we try, what we find is that some of the first references to Satan show up in Numbers, and they just talk about an angel which is in opposition, anything in opposition. So one of the very first references has to do with the Balaam and his donkey. You remember the story of the talking donkey? That story is really fun. Someday we'll have to talk about that story, where it comes from and what it all means. But we have the story of the talking donkey, and in there, an angel of Jehovah confronts him and is called as an adversary, as a Satan. Now, clearly, that's a reference. What's that? I believe so. Yeah. As an adversary, Satan. So Satan means in Hebrew an adversary, somebody who is in opposition. And here we have an angel of God who is the adversary. Not the adversary of God, but the adversary in this case of Balaam. We also have references in Psalms, Chronicles, same thing. In one case in Chronicles, Satan stood up against Israel, and there stood up an adversary against Israel, another translation of the same verse in 1 Chronicles 21:1. In Job, a guy named Satan shows up, and he comes up to God and says, God's like, where have you been? And Satan says, well, I've been going up and down in the earth looking over the world. And God says, well, have you noticed Job? He's pretty good. And Satan says, no one's really good. And God says, well, let me prove it to you. And they make a wager over whether Job will stay righteous when he's tested. What we have in these early versions of Satan in the biblical text seems to be a belief in a heavenly court that is very much like an earthly court. So you have a king, and he's the judge. You have a prosecuting attorney and a defensive attorney, and the adversary is the prosecuting attorney. And Satan acts like the prosecuting attorney. He's not considered evil. He serves a vital role in the court, and there's no being evil. We have references to Lucifer in Isaiah 13:14. And if you go back to my lecture on Mesopotamia, the second lecture on Mesopotamia, part 2, Kingship and Law, we talked about that chapter, and we pointed out that that chapter is about the Babylonian king claiming to be God and putting himself up as if he was God. It's not actually about a fallen angel or about the devil at all. And the whole name Lucifer is a confusion of a translation, which we're not going to redo all that. But when you put all this evidence together, now here's the problem when you talk to people who believe in the other version of the story where Satan is real, etc., and you talk to them, they will interpret these biblical texts differently than we have here. All we can say for certain is that there is a way to interpret the biblical material such that the first references to Satan as we know him today show up after the Babylonian captivity and after the return from exile. And they actually show up in the most clear form in the pseudepigraphic writings like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jasher, some of these very late texts that will show up in the midst of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So by the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a belief in a Satan is very common among the Jews of that time. It's not actually common today. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have these other books, the Book of Enoch, where a belief in Satan that's very much like the Christian Satan is common, and it's after the return from exile, meaning it's after that first contact with Persia. So, again, that depends on how you interpret the biblical material, but there is an interpretation of the biblical material that allows this argument that Jewish conception of Satan appears only after their contact with Zoroastrianism. And at that contact, we would expect influence to flow from Zoroastrianism into Judaism, not the other way around, because again, the lesser society tends to borrow from the greater. And by great, I just mean, the size of the empire, the controlling, it's not supposed to be a judgment of people in that. Anyway. Let me give another example. Let's talk about the creation. These are the Zoroastrian days of creation periods. They actually divide it up into 7 periods. They create the sky, water, earth, vegetation, animals, mankind, and fire, a sacred element. In the Hebrew one, you create light and dark, water and sky, earth and vegetation, sun and moon, fish and birds, animals and mankind, and then rest, the Sabbath, sacred time. So the 7th day establishes the sacred element or the sacred time, and you have 6 days before that of the creation. So 6 days of creation. Again, the details of this are so sufficiently similar that this is not the sort of thing that just spontaneously arises from someone, especially just in the way you number it. The order is the same, the numbering is the same. It's not exactly the same, but it's very, very close. The numbering is the same, the ordering is very close. Somebody is borrowing from somebody. Who is borrowing from who? The Enuma Elish, one possibility is both of them are borrowing from an earlier source. So the Enuma Elish is the Mesopotamian Babylonian creation. The Persians come in, conquer Babylon, and adopt a lot of Babylonian customs. So in the Enuma Elish we have, in the beginning was chaos, Tiamat, or water. Now it just so happens in the Hebrew one, before the creation days start, at the very beginning there was a dark watery abyss, the way the text reads. So we can connect these two. We start with chaos, and then we have the 7 days of creation. There are not 7 specific periods mentioned in the Enuma Elish, but the order of creation is heaven, earth, sun, moon, stars, man, and then the creation. It ends with the creation of sacred space, the temple. And that's the way the Enuma Elish ends. So in the Enuma Elish, you start with chaos, you create the sun, moon, stars, man, and you have a sacred temple space. In the Jewish, you start with chaos, you create light, water, earth, sun, fish, animals, and then sacred time, which is explicitly connected by the Torah to the temple. Both of them are similar things, sacred space, sacred time. Again, this connection is too detailed to be an accident. The Jewish author of Genesis 1, I shouldn't be saying, by the way, the Jewish order of creation. This is the Jewish order for Genesis 1. Genesis 2 has a different order. But the Genesis 1 author is clearly borrowing from the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish we know is older because we have copies of it from a long time before the biblical authors are writing. So the Genesis author is borrowing from the Enuma Elish. You could posit that the Enuma Elish then influences the Jewish creation and then influences the Zoroastrian, and they're both coming from the same source. The problem with that is that the details of the days aren't actually in the Enuma Elish, and yet that's one of the things they share, so that doesn't work. One of the things that's useful to point out is that the Hebrew version of this is a poem. You start with the dark, watery abyss, you create light, dark, water, sky, earth, and vegetation. The light and dark are the environment in which the sun and moon moves. The water and sky are the environment in which the fish and birds move. You ever wondered why they create the sun on day 4, but you create the light and dark on day 1? That's because this is the things that move within this environment. These are the things that move within this environment, and the animals and mankind move within the earth and the vegetation, and then you create sacred time and you rest. The Zoroastrian version of this is missing the poetic structure. So I'm going to propose a theory here, and it says the Enuma Elish is the place the Hebrews and the Zoroastrians borrow from. The Christians borrow from the Hebrews, and by that later connection point, when these two are kind of rivals, the Zoroastrian refines this order with the concept of days and from here, but by then they've forgotten the poetic structure, and so when they create their version, they don't create the same parallelism that was found in the Hebrew version because they didn't notice that that's what was happening with those days. Go ahead, David. This is a theory. So to prove this theory right or wrong, what you'd have to do is figure out when did the Zoroastrian tradition start listing the 6 days. And again, that's something I don't know how to do. And there's a whole bunch of research papers we can now go read.
Just to clarify, the Zoroastrian is given as 6 days.
Yes, with the 7th day creation of fire, but they will often talk about 6 days of creation, and then the 7th day is somehow special where God creates fire, which is the sacred element.
That also corresponds.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Very, very clearly borrowed in some way. And again, so if you posit that this interaction happens at that second connection between the Zoroastrians and the Christians, then you would posit that it goes the other direction. So I don't know how to express this, but if I were going into religious studies as a major, as a new career, this is what I would research. Because this is by far the most interesting question I think you could ask. And I think the reason for that is it tells us the origins of a lot of what we as a nation and believe and it today. Where did it come from? Why do we believe in Satan? Why do we believe in 6 days of creation? Did we get that from the Zoroastrians? Did they get that from us? Why do we baptize? Why do we have a Eucharist? Why do we believe in the virgin birth? Why? And if you're an opponent of Christianity, one of the new atheists who want to prove Christianity wrong, you take Zoroastrian and you assume that Christianity and Judaism borrowed everything from Zoroastrianism, and therefore it's not a revealed religion, and God is wrong, and the Bible is wrong, and you feel like you've disproved all of that. If you're a defender of Christianity, you assume that Zoroastrianism borrowed all this stuff from the Jews and the Christians, or from an original myth that was older than both that happened to be the truth, because this is really what happened if you want to be a fundamentalist Christian. And again, the difficulty is connecting the evidence in terms of the dating. The dating is the problem in all of these cases, because there's questions about when the Jewish texts were written, there's questions about when the Torah was written, there's questions about when the Zoroastrian texts were written, there's questions about how old the Gathas are, when the difficulties in maintaining either of those arguments. So if you've listened to a new atheist tell you that the Zoroastrian or the Christians just stole everything from the Zoroastrians, he might be right, but if he claims that he knows that's for certain and that history makes that case with no uncertainty attached to it, he's probably selling you something. Here is much higher than we give it credit for because of the difficulties we have with the dating. I've posited 2 possibilities for the Satan and for the days of creation, and they go in opposite directions. But you can make arguments for both of those that claim I was wrong. And so what I'm hoping is that by being exposed to some of this, you'll be a little bit more of a wise consumer of some of these things, because these arguments don't happen in a vacuum. They happen, and they're being made by people with an agenda to push one view over the other, and both sides tend to ignore the uncertainty when they try to do that to you, because we don't actually know a lot of these things. So here's our conclusion with Zoroastrianism, and then we'll do Hinduism next month. The problem, we're at war between 2 forces, 2 coexistent forces of good and evil. That's why evil is in the world. That's why we can have a good God and still have evil things happen in the world, because there's also an evil force that's equally coexistent. But that evil force will lose because mankind will eventually choose good, and we have our agency, and we can tip the scales of that balance. It's been balanced for all eternity. We can tip it one way or the other, and good will eventually triumph. So the solution is to choose good and fight for Ahura Mazda. And the way you do that is with purity of thought, word, and deed, and the rituals they perform, the garments they wear, the myths they tell, all tie back to purity of thought, word, and deed. They have a white garment that's supposed to remind them of purity. Every time they get up in the morning, they tie the law that represents their scriptures around their waist, and they have to tie it and retie it to remind them of who they are, what they believe, and that they're soldiers in this war who have chosen a side. And so they take that promise with them everywhere they go. They wear it so they never forget, so that their thoughts can be clean, so that their actions can be pure, and so they can be ritually pure, and they wash themselves, and they perform these rituals of purification at special points in their life. Throughout their life, their priests will separate themselves so that they can be pure from all the people around them, so that they can then be the officiators of these rituals in purity, etc. So everything they do is really aimed at this war through this purity of thought, word, and deed, both in their beliefs that we did last month and the rituals they did this month. I hope I've given some sort of a feeling for what Zoroastrianism is. I've tried. I've probably made mistakes. Like I said, Zoroastrianism is a topic I've had to teach myself a lot this month, and I've learned a lot with you. And so if I've made some mistakes, by all means, correct me, and we'll try to learn together. But this has been one of the most fascinating things I've ever studied in my life, and so I hope you found it as interesting as I have. Next month, we'll do Hinduism. I also want to remind you that this Sunday we're going to have a second of the biblical history, biblical literacy and scholarship class, and we're going to be reading Genesis 1 and 2, which we did a little bit of today. I admit I double dipped because if we're going to talk about an example of borrowing, it might as well be about the Genesis 1 story because I've been studying that anyway. So if you want to read those, pick your favorite translations. There's actually 3 different translations in the back there in our library. Read 2 chapters and come next week and we'll, this Sunday, and we'll talk about Genesis 1 and 2. And I hope to see some of you there for that too. That should be really interesting stuff. It's in the normal forum time, which is at 9:30. Out there, out in the fellowship hall at 9:30. So hope to see some of you there this Sunday. Any burning questions before we quit? Go ahead, David. Anyone? Push the button at the bottom. Yep.
Can we go back to the slide about correspondence in the creation story?
Which one?
That one? The Zoroastrian in Hebrew. Okay? So it just occurs to me that if you want to think about these questions of who got what from whom, at least the Jewish story is tied to the week. And my understanding has been that scholars believe that it's the Israelite tradition from which we get this pattern of an invariant week, right? Because in some ways it's really unusual, right? That usually things like calendars and such are tied, first of all, to observations of things like the new moon, and these things move around, and then sometimes it gets systematized into some fixed number of days, but it's always complex. But the invariant 7-day week, I think, is unique to the Israelites and their various descendant cultures. But it'd be very interesting to know that, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily prove that, for instance, you might find that the Zoroastrian week. I don't know, right?
They do now.
Do they?
But everybody does.
Yeah, everybody does, right? And the question is whether or not they did, 300 years ago, right?
Right. My understanding,
and even then, they could have gotten it from the Muslims.
Yeah. So I believe that someone was talking about this, and I'll have to go find the paper, but I was curious about this, so I was reading about it, and someone else brought that up, and I believe what their conclusion is. See, the problem is I read this about a month ago when I was preparing for the first class, and then I didn't teach that piece till this month, and now I'm trying to remember what I read. But as my understanding was they mentioned that very fact, and I think what they said is that there's no evidence of the Babylonians having a 7-day week. And that's Babylonians. The Persians come and they adopt the Babylonian calendar. So I really shouldn't be commenting on that sort of thing because I don't remember it well enough to be sure I'm not messing it up. But I believe the answer to that is that the early Zoroastrians, at the time of the first contact with Jews, didn't have a 7-day week. So it probably didn't go that direction then. When the Zoroastrians interact with the Christians, they already had a 7-day week, and you could expect it to go the other direction, which again is the kind of theory I posited. And I believe the existence of the 7-day week corroborates that theory, but I need to look that up because I may be messing it up. I can't remember for sure. Dave, can you pass the mic back that way? And
mostly now it's seen as sort of a crackpot theory. There really hasn't been any proper way to verify it, but there are people out there, both now and in the past, who have considered the proposition that the Indo-Aryans, or Indo-Europeans more broadly, and the Afro-Semites have a common ancestor, culturally and linguistically. It's still hugely controversial, though. It's very, very difficult to prove whether or not languages are related to each other when you have no written record. We have no audio recordings after a certain point, so it just gets harder and harder.
Yeah, but you can do sort of things like cognate studies, looking for cognates, and it's the same sort of thing we do if people are genetically related. You look for the number of mutations and you kind of count them up.
Of course, there are other people nowadays who are saying that even though we can't prove with the old ways that we've been using that the Afro-Semites and the Indo-Europeans have a common ancestor, certain facts like cave paintings being tens of thousands of years old and showing up everywhere prove that there would be a common linguistic ancestor at all.
Well, we know about a genetic common ancestor. Common linguistic ancestor is harder because the languages are both merging and dividing. Which is a little different, makes it harder than the genetic problem. And let me give you an example. The Egyptian is a mix of African language. It has cognates in further South African languages, and it also has cognates in Canaanite, Babylonian, Semitic languages. So, and then the Akkadians are Semitic, but the Sumerians are Indo-European. The way around?
Oh, no way.
Well, they're related to European languages. I'm pretty sure.
Well, I would take a look into that. It gets very hard to tell after a certain point. But the reason why I bring it up is because if there actually was a proper way to trace back a common Indo-European and Afro-Semitic ancestor, culturally, not just genetically, but culturally, would that explain?
No, so this stuff is much later. We know the language connections by this point, and so we know we don't know the earlier origins of the languages, but the sorts of connections we're talking about are happening in 500 BC, not 3000 BC, etc. So it's an interesting question that you raise, and one that a lot of people have worked on, and I haven't prepared that material to teach it, and I can probably mess it up if I start doing it from the top of my head like I did with the Akkadians and those questions go back a lot further than what we're talking about here. What were you going to say, David?
Well, I was just going to give a little background. So linguists generally believe, I think, that Proto-Indo-European broke up maybe about 3000 BCE or a little earlier, and that similarly Proto-Semitic broke up at about the same time. The Sumerians go back that far, and in general, linguists describe Hittite as the earliest written Indo-European language. And that's considerably later than Sumerian.
Yes.
But the other thing is the Semitic languages are definitely related to what are called the Hamitic languages. That's what Jordy was talking about. He was talking about Afro-Semitic, right? And the Hamitic languages, there's no question. I mean, I could look at a list of, pronouns in Berber and recognize half of them from Hebrew, right? It's that, it's that close. And the Hamitic languages include ancient Egyptian and the Berber languages of Northwest Africa, but also stuff that's farther south in Africa as well. And that split had to come even earlier. So there are lots of theories about a common linguistic origin for Indo-European and Afro-Semitic, but it's got to be way back there.
Right.
Right. What you're saying about, even 3000 BCE is way too late for a common origin.
Yeah. So I still need to, now I'm going to go look up Sumerian because I was almost positive that, by the way, if you ever want to learn a language, don't learn that one. I spent about a month trying to teach myself Sumerian and I gave up. That's one of the hardest things I've ever tried to do in my life. And as I remember, they told me at the time it was related to Indo-European languages. You're telling me it's not. You're probably right because this was 15 years ago. but now I'm going to go look that up because now you've made me fascinated. But anyway, those questions of origins are different than these questions of origins. They're much earlier, and we're dealing with much later connections. Go ahead, Les. Go ahead. Oh, I thought you were going to. You're just holding the mic. I thought you were going to pass it. Oh, go get Tina wants to.
So when does Jainism link into all of this kind of timeline? Is it a similar timeline? I thought it was around kind of the Hinduism timeline too, but I could be wrong.
I don't know.
They're Dharmists, yeah.
David might know. David knows more things. I don't actually know when the Jains connected to these religious traditions. So that's okay, David. Talk all you want. When you have the answer, give it.
I just had the phone ringing in my ear with the headpiece. I'm less confused now. Jnana Mahavira was the founder of Jainism, and he was a contemporary of the Buddha. So we're talking like 450 BCE.
Okay.
Right, and there are stories. Certainly, the Buddhists have lots of stories about interactions between the Buddha and Jnana Mahavira, and I suspect the Jains do too. So it's like Buddhism. It's there are lots of questions, obviously, about the development of Buddhism, but we know about when it started, right, and by whom, right, in a way that we don't for a lot of these others.
Yeah, even Zoroastrianism. I think if you remember my first class, we discussed the date for Zoroaster's life, and we had numbers that were thousands of years apart, and most of them we can kind of dismiss. It was probably around 600 BC, before 600, but 700 BC, something like that. But we don't honestly know. So, okay, I think we need to wrap up. We're over time, so thank you all for coming. I'll see you next month, and we'll talk about Hinduism.